past month has doubtlessly been one of the busiest ever in American political history. Here to help us interpret the glut of headlines, we're joined as we are each month by attorney and local government expert Chris Hand. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Ann.
Thank you for being here.
Of course.
So, we've seen some dramatic cutbacks in staffing at the federal level, including federal employees here on the First Coast. It's been very chaotic. I think everyone would agree. Is that a bug or a feature of this efficiency effort?
Well, first of all, I think given kind of who's running this effort, I think it's very consistent with how, for example, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, which is now called X, this process is familiar to people who were at that organization, who were paying attention to that organization at the time. Twitter laid off, I think, about 75% of its workforce. A lot of these different approaches that we saw there, we're now seeing on a much larger scale and a much more impactful scale in terms of services to citizens at the federal government. But you used a key word there, Ann, and I think it's important to distinguish. You used the word efficiency, and of course, this is called the Department of Governmental Efficiency. I think one of the things we've learned in the now slightly more than a month since Donald Trump became president again is that this might be called an efficiency exercise, but it really isn't an efficiency exercise. It's more of an elimination exercise in terms of the layoffs and the attempts to kind of close some of the departments from within U.S. Agency for International Development being a good example, and now seeing others in the federal government as well. An efficiency exercise, and I know something about this because part of what I do for a living is work with a team to advise state and local governments around the country on how to make their operations more efficient. An efficiency exercise takes a very different approach. It's more thoughtful. One wants to kind of learn exactly how the agency works. And I think most importantly, wants to talk to the employees of that agency because we have found that often they have the best ideas on how to make their agency more efficient, whether that's in terms of process or systems or organization. And once you've gone through that process, you typically can identify pretty significant long term taxpayer savings that are sustainable, but also minimize the impact on customers because a true efficiency exercise is designed to improve customer service at the end of the day, not harm it. And I think that's why some people and we're beginning to see a lot of public opinion expressing concern about the DOGE exercise because it feels a lot less it's about efficiency than it is about elimination. And so that's where, some of the polling we're seeing, close to 60% of Americans are, concerned about the sort of shuttering of USAID from within, the layoffs of federal employees. They're worried about the impacts on services, including agencies like Social Security and some others that are very near and dear to the hearts of Americans. So, and also now beginning to see some pushback from not only from Congress, but also Trump agencies themselves, cabinet secretaries. Just last weekend, Elon Musk put out a tweet, saying that every federal employee had to respond with what they did, send an email with what they did last week, or they'd be terminated. And multiple departments in the Trump administration advised their employees, you don't have to do that. So you're now seeing some pushback to that effort. And I think it's partially because it's not an efficiency effort, it's more of an elimination effort.
You talk about the assignment that Elon Musk gave for people to basically say five things that they had done the previous week and email it in and saying if they didn't, they would be terminated. He even called it, the word he used to describe the assignment was inane in his own tweet. Um, but he has said that people will be terminated if they don't respond. I'm curious, first of all, if saying something on Twitter counts as an official notification for the purposes of someone being terminated, and whether you think there is agreement between the Trump administration, between Trump himself and Elon Musk about whether that's something they actually would attempt to do.
Well, there's a lot of mixed signals on that question. First of all, I think there is a legal question. I mean, look, there's a lot of legal questions surrounding Elon Musk's role in this process, right? And because we're not entirely sure what his status is. I mean, we've been told he's not a government employee, but he is a special government employee. He technically is not in charge of DOGE. There's a staffer who's been appointed as sort of the administrator there. So I think there are a lot of swirling questions that will ultimately be resolved in court about what his exact authority is. And as I said, some clear discomfort among the public among having someone who's unelected and obviously a little bit different than a typical unelected staffer. This, special government employee or not, happens to be the richest person in the world. So I mean, there's that has a different level of influence than your typical staffer would in these sorts of situations. But I think there are some legal questions, and obviously questions within the Trump administration itself. For example, the Secretary of Defense basically told staff, "We're going to review that request. We'll coordinate all responses." There have been other agencies that have done that as well. Each of the Trump cabinet heads have been, at this point, have been approved by the U.S. Senate. So that gives them a certain standing that others who haven't been Senate confirmed have not. And the White House, again, has had mixed signals. On the one hand, President Trump at one point said, that he's asked Mr. Musk to become more aggressive. On the other hand, the White House press secretary said at one point, we respect our cabinet agencies. President Trump appointed them and defers to them in the running of their agency. So it seems like there's, not only is the whole world trying to figure out this process, but I think the Trump administration trying to work its way through that as well.
And the Trump administration and the DOGE folks have had to walk back some of their early claims of huge savings. Is that right?
Both claims of savings and some of their early actions. For example, at one point, and what they're calling the wall of receipts, kind of the savings that DOGE is alleging that it's made in this process. For example, one of the early receipts was they claim they had saved $8 billion at the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency through some contract changes. Well, in fact, it was not 8 billion with a B, but 8 million with an M. So that was one of a series of claims that they changed on their website when it was clear that that amount was not correct. Have also had to reverse some of the actions they took. As part of these federal government layoffs, one of the groups they laid off was a series of employees who work for the National Nuclear Security Agency, who obviously have the very crucial job of nuclear security. They were all laid off and had to be rehired, and there were several other instances of that in different agencies as well. I think the Office of Management and Budget was one. There were several others where, again, some of these sort of indiscriminate firings, particularly of probationary employees, they then had to walk back as they realized it would have a massive impact on services.
I mean, what is that doing to just the tissue of an agency? I would imagine that the folks who work in nuclear security are, you know, dedicated to what they do and returning to work as needed. But I would imagine that that's not without damage. And certainly all these other agencies where there have been layoffs, including some probationary employees who actually were on probation because they'd received a promotion after many years of service. It wasn't like they were a new hire, also being dismissed. What does that do to the culture of a government agency?
Well, as you can imagine, it's very damaging to morale. I mean, I know federal workers who are caught up in some of this, and I think there are misconceptions. And first of all, I want to make very clear: every government should always be going through an efficiency exercise. I think that's really important for governments at every level to be constantly looking at ways at improving their services to customers and operating more efficiently and as friendly to the taxpayer a way as possible. But what's happening here, to your point, Ann, I think is very damaging to the morale of these agencies and can be obviously, and at the end of the day, impact services. I think there are some misconceptions out there about government workers at times. I mean, as you know, I was the chief of staff of the city of Jacksonville for 4 years and really just had the privilege to work with city of Jacksonville employees who I found to be hardworking and dedicated. And you see that and in the local and state governments I work with around the country, you see that as well. Very dedicated employees who are in that role largely because they care about providing service to the public and they want to render that public service. It's not to say that efficiencies can't be made. You can't find ways to do things with fewer people, but the way this is being done, I think, is very damaging to morale and sends a signal, perhaps, to people who are considering public service as a future career that maybe this is not the area that they want to go into, which is, sad and concerning because, again, no matter where anyone stands on the ideological spectrum, I think people agree that government at some level provides services that are necessary to citizens. This kind of indiscriminate approach, I think, not only erodes those services, but also erodes the morale of people who are trying to provide those services.
We're talking to Chris Hand about the latest headlines at the state, local, and federal level. And if you'd like to join our conversation, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email First Coast Connect at wjct.org. We have a call from Wells Todd on the South Side. Good morning, Wells. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann, and hello to you guys, Chris. I want to point out that One of the things that they're doing with these government programs is they're trying to cripple these programs so that in the future they can say they don't work, so they can completely annihilate and end them. The billionaire class is coming for our Social Security. I'm African American. I'm 78 years old, and this is just for everybody in this town who is retired. We need to begin to organize because Trump is showing us that he's doing nothing for us. There hasn't been one thing that he has done to improve the lives of the average American in this country. And if we don't start to organize, if we don't start to shut things down, we're going to see terrible, terrible results of what this guy is doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Wells. Chris, this is a federal effort currently, but our governor has said he'd like to take those lessons that DOGE has offered and bring that model to Florida. Talk a little bit about what that might look like on a state level. He said he wants to target some 900 government jobs, look at efficiencies at the university level, even get into auditing local governments.
Well, as this is something obviously the governor announced earlier this week that he wants to have what he's terming a Florida DOGE process in which talked about looking at trying to eliminate maybe up to 900 state government positions, perhaps phase out up to 70 kind of regulatory boards and commissions at the state level. Also do kind of audits of universities, state universities in Florida, and for that matter, look at local government spending as well. And obviously, there's been somewhat of a fraught relationship between the state government, particularly this governor's office, and local governments around the state in recent years. What's interesting about that call is, Florida already has, by virtue of a constitutional amendment in 2006, already has a governmental efficiency process that's supposed to take place every 4 years, and the next one is slated to start in January of 2027, which coincidentally is the month that a new governor will take office then. But I think we can expect, I mean, maybe not the same exact approach as the federal level because there isn't sort of an Elon Musk like a figure to kind of lead this effort. But probably sort of a, kind of a continuation of some of the themes we've seen during the DeSantis administration, particularly the focus on kind of universities through these audits. And obviously that's something where the governor's office has really sort of leaned in recent years as their oversight of kind of the state college and university system. And I think one that particularly to keep an eye on is what is this review of local government spending look like? Look, this is
Is that legal to audit local governments?
well, I think the answer with many things is it depends, and I think there will be legal challenges to that. The state auditor in Florida does have some ability to kind of audit local organizations, and we've seen that in different local governments over the years. Most recently in the city of Gainesville, where the state decided to go in and audit their utility as sort of a preliminary step toward changing the governance of that utility in state law. So there is some ability to do that. I think the concern among local governments in Florida is that they are in an increase, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this on different subjects, but they're in an increasingly difficult fiscal period right now. The American Rescue Plan money from the federal government has gone away. Revenues are not nearly what they once were. So most local governments, not just in Florida, because again, I'm seeing this around the country, are in sort of increasingly in deficit situations. This year, the city council auditors have projected a deficit of, perhaps $80 million here at the city of Jacksonville. Could be more, could be less. We'll see what the final numbers look like. So I think local governments are particularly nervous about hearing about this Florida DOGE effort at a time where they're already sort of fiscally challenged and
E-
not sure what this process might produce.
Explain though. I mean, if the goal is efficiency or cutting or auditing, how would that? What's the interplay with a deficit situation? Why would that impact that?
Well, I mean, I think it could do. Number one, it puts additional pressures on a local government at a time where they may or may not have the resources to sort of deal with those pressures as well. As we've sort of seen in this process, it doesn't always. Some of the recommendations that are made here, like for example, if a local government's going to have to cut money anyway, as opposed to as part of trying to deal with a deficit situation, additional recommendations that come in from the state level could even impact services even more than a local government was originally kind of intending to do through whatever sort of cutting or efficiency exercise they were planning on conducting. So it could have the effect of exacerbating some of the deficit effects that we see in local governments
Sure.
around
And
the
if the
state.
federal DOGE is the model, we would presume that it wouldn't be a very surgical set of recommendations to move towards efficiency or reductions in cost.
Well, that's right. And in fairness, we don't know that the federal model is what the state is going to do yet. It's not entirely clear. So, I think we have to wait and find out what that approach is. But look, this federal model has other implications for state and local governments as well. We talked about this previously on the program, but it was clear even before Donald Trump became president that states and local governments were going to be receiving less money from Washington in terms of federal grants. Those are crucial for state and local budgets in many ways. Those are clearly going away, or if not entirely going away, going to be reduced significantly as we move forward. So again, I think part of the challenge that local governments are facing is they're feeling a little bit squeezed between state actions like the one we just talked about, some of these federal actions as well. So it makes for a challenging fiscal period for governments that are trying to provide services to citizens.
I know that there has been some comments from the Democrats in Florida about if there were an effort to examine inefficiencies and government waste, that whatever was discovered would just be embarrassing for the GOP leadership since they have had the governor's office since 1996 and both houses of the legislature since 1998. I think that Nikki Fried sort of said, if you find it, it's on you.
Well, I mean, I did see those comments. I mean, again, I do want to emphasize that the goal of government efficiency is a good thing. That's what something the government should be doing. And listen, well, again, we don't know exactly what the contours of this Florida DOGE effort is. If this turns out to be a kind of a comprehensive, thoughtful look at Florida government and truly figuring out, which functions are being done correctly, which ones aren't, where they can be improved and made more efficient. Government should always be encouraged to do that, no matter how long a particular party has been in power or hasn't been in power. So I think that overall goal is something that local and state governments should be doing. As always, and the devil's in the details. How is that process actually going to work? Is it going to take that thoughtful, comprehensive approach to truly taking a look at state agencies and understanding, what's working well, what isn't working well? How can we shift this around for the benefit of taxpayers, while also preserving services that we provide to the general public? If that's the exercise, I think that's positive. That's something the state should and local government should always be doing. I think the challenge is if it's not truly an efficiency exercise, if it becomes an elimination exercise, then I think that can have impacts on services. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of public opinion concern about the DOGE effort, because increasingly it feels like that effort is going to negatively impact services that people receive.
We've got an email from Michael. He says the sad and ironic fact is some, if not many, of the people across government being fired voted for Trump. You get what you ask for when you support a gaslighting demagogue. I'd like to see the media talk to some of these people, ask them if they voted for Trump. Basically, you get what you ask for, America. I want to move on, if we can, Chris, just to talk about the legislative session that gets rolling Tuesday. We just had a kind of mini legislative session in Tallahassee, but there are a number of things on the agenda. What are you going to be watching for?
Well, first, the general dynamic of the session, I think, is likely to be very different than sessions past. And we saw a lot of evidence of that in that special session you just referred to, Ann. Traditionally, the governor's office and the legislature have been viewed as co equal branches of government. And they've had, at times cooperative relationships, but tended to be institutions that stood up for their own prerogatives and sort of made sure they were protecting their role in the process. My former boss and mentor, Bob Graham, was governor from 1979 to 1986. And I know some of the biggest headaches he had in when he was governor was pushback from the legislature, which at the time was controlled by his own party. That's just a part of government. That's part of the push and pull of the checks and balances system. It's a healthy thing for an executive branch and a legislative branch to have different ideas and try and kind of work together or in times oppose each other and work those out. We haven't really seen that dynamic in recent years, so I think it was sort of a back to the future moment for many when in this past session, both the Senate President, Ben Albritton, and the House Speaker, Danny Perez, made it very clear that they were going to try and protect their institutional prerogatives. They passed a different immigration bill than the one the governor wanted. They overrode his veto of a bunch of spending from last year's budget.
And these are all Republicans, we
These are all
should be clear.
Republicans, right? So I think that is going to be probably the biggest kind of the top line difference we see this year. That as they are going through legislation or trying to pass a $116 billion budget, the governor's proposed one, I think they're going to make a lot of changes to that, and we're going to see the legislature really exercise its institutional prerogatives in a way that we maybe haven't in recent years. I think that'll take the form of a lot of issues. We will see, I think, some issues related to Washington. I think there's been an effort by this legislature, many of whom endorsed Ron DeSantis when he ran for governor, to realign and have their support be for President Trump now. So I suspect there will be some issues, whether it's more on immigration. There's been some talk about fluoridation of the water supply, some other issues that I think we'll be curious to see how much the legislature aligns with the Trump administration. But I think there'll be other issues they're dealing with as well. Housing and housing affordability will be a big issue, particularly condos. As you know, in the aftermath of Surfside, there were a bunch of new regulations put in place. Some condos have pushed back, saying this is just too costly. So I think you'll see activity on the condominium front and on trying to find new ways to create housing affordability in Florida. Insurance will be another issue. Obviously that's a continuing challenge for Floridian citizens, which many Floridian Citizens Property Insurance Company, which many residents have had to go into now. It recently had a premium increase, which I think probably designed to get people back out of the private market. But I think we'll see that come up again. The Senate president has launched what he calls a rural renaissance program, where he's trying to invest about $200 million to help with education and healthcare and infrastructure in the 31 of 67 Florida counties that are designated as rural counties. And then I think you'll see a lot of controversy on a couple of the issues I mentioned earlier, but things like gun safety. There's been some bills introduced, one of which would, lower the age you can own certain types of guns like rifles. It was raised to 21 in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting. There's a bill that would lower that back down to 18. There's a bill that would pass the so-called open carry provisions that would allow people to just sort of openly kind of carry firearms in the state.
Including
Um,
on college campuses.
Correct, right. There's a bill that does that. So we'll see where some of that goes. For example, back in November when they had their organizational session, the Senate president on that open carry issue said that he would not support that law enforcement had been clear that it was not in support of that and that he was supportive of law enforcement, so he would not support that. So some of those bills we'll just have to see where we'll go. But I think the bottom line of this legislature will be one in which we see the Senate and the House really kind of stepping up in a way to exercise their institutional prerogatives in a way they maybe haven't in recent years.
I wanna ask you about the budget issue because, as you noted, the Republicans created 4 working groups to evaluate the governor's last year's budget, which is curious, but, because that was already implemented and approved, but they're looking in the rear view, deciding whether the spending cuts that the governor asked for were appropriate, his vetoes. What are the implications for the upcoming budget, even as they're looking back on this last year's budget to decide if they wanna reinstate money that was cut?
I think probably the chief implication is that this legislature is going to take a much more active role in writing the budget than maybe previous years have done. I mean, the governor has proposed a budget. That's obviously how this process begins. And I think in recent years, the governor has largely, again, the legislature has certainly made changes going through the process, but the governor has then, sort of in the last several years, vetoed a significantly large amount of money in the budget. I mean, very sort of famously at one point made some of these cuts while the Senate president and the House Speaker, who supported some of the things being cut, were sort of standing right behind him in that exercise. I think you're going to see that change. And I think part of what these vetoes in January, overriding the vetoes in these working groups is about, is probably to the legislature sending a message to the governor that, A, they're going to play a more active role this year. They're going to take more command of the budget process, which is their constitutional authority under Florida. I mean, it's the legislature that has budget writing authority. And sending a message about potential vetoes as well, that, they've now overridden spending vetoes from last year, and think they're trying to make it clear they're prepared to do the same again in 2025.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about the local, state, and political headlines of the last month with Chris Hand. Got a comment from Liz on Facebook saying, Chris Hand always makes such sense. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, we can all agree that we need people to serve in the public sector. Pardon the paraphrasing, she says. Thank you. Also, a message from Jim on Facebook. What would be the ramifications to the cities and people of Florida if Governor DeSantis and the right wing legislators succeed in banning property taxes statewide? That's something that has been floated.
Yeah, and I mean, there's some possibility. I mean, the governor's floated the idea that would require a constitutional amendment here in Florida, and the governor has floated that as an idea for the 2026 ballot. There's actually a bill that's been introduced in the legislature this year that would abolish property taxes. I mean, that would mean a sea change in governmental funding. For example, there's a group called the Florida Policy Council, which has just done an analysis of that and found that just to simply maintain the level of service and revenue we have right now, abolishing property taxes would require us to raise the state sales tax to 12% from where it is right now. That would obviously be by far, not even close, the largest sales tax state sales tax in the country.
It's about, well, I mean, with the county additions, it's usually around seven,
Seven
right?
and a half in this county right now because of the additions, but this sort of base state level is a 6% level. So that would essentially be a doubling of that
Okay.
sales tax. There's a lot of concern about sort of sales tax in terms of the regressive nature of it, and so that has caused some concern. Obviously, property tax changes also have implications for local governments, which fund most of their operations on ad valorem revenue. They get revenue from other sources as well, but property taxes are a predominant source of revenue for local governments as well.
What's the ideological bent there or the ideological justification for saying we shouldn't have property taxes?
Uh, and again, I think a lot of this is going to be determined and sort of expressed as we go forward. But I think there's some, and we've seen this in some other places as well. There's some opposition to having taxation on property we own, right? That it's the same idea that our homes are our castles, and that is not the way that the government should not be taxing real property we own. Again, I think when these ideas have been floated in the past and this has come up in Florida government or variations on this from time to time. I think the ultimate determination has been it's kind of like what Winston Churchill used to say about democracy. It's the worst form of government except all the rest. I think people have sort of concluded at times that some of the alternatives to changing this property tax structure could be even more burdensome on taxpayers than eliminating it. That's not to say that we should always be looking at our different types of revenue to figure out which makes sense, what's the fairest to taxpayers, what's the best way to approach this. But when this property tax situation has been reviewed in the past, I think the conclusion has almost always been, well, the alternatives would just be unacceptable. They would be even more burdensome to taxpayers. So people haven't ultimately chosen to go in that direction. We'll have to see, what this process yields and whether that goes on the ballot or not in 2026. We're a long, long way from that.
I want to ask you about the 2026 governor's race, which in some ways is a long way off, but in some ways has already gotten underway. You mentioned this rift that exists in the Florida legislature. I wonder if you can help characterize how what we're seeing in terms of candidates for governor or potential candidates for governor could impact that divide.
Matt Dixon, who's a former a Florida Times Union reporter who's now with NBC News, wrote a really interesting book about a year ago about the interplay between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. And I think we're going to see that continue over the course of this governor's race because Donald Trump has now made his choice as to who he wants to be governor of Florida. He's endorsed U.S. Representative Byron Donalds from the Naples area, who's a member of the House and is now officially announced that he's going to be a candidate for governor. It increasingly appears that his primary opponent his main opponent in the Republican primary, could be the First Lady of Florida, Casey DeSantis, who obviously is a veteran of journalism here in the First Coast, was with multiple broadcast stations here, has been the First Lady for the last 6 years. The governor is increasingly talking up the prospect of her running, so it feels like there could be yet another sort of Trump DeSantis a proxy war in a Republican primary going forward. There's been other candidates talked about. The state agriculture commissioner, Wilton Simpson, has been talked about as a candidate, although it seems like that's probably less likely now that the President Trump has sort of picked a candidate. But I think we're going to see. Look, I think part of the impact we're going to see on this is we are going to have a new governor, whoever it is, whether that's one of the Republican or Democratic candidates in January of 2027. That I think also emboldens the legislature in this special session because, again, Ron DeSantis, by Florida Constitution, his time in office is limited. In January 2027, he will no longer be governor. I think that's also what the prospect of a new governor being in office is also what's fueling some of the dynamics we're seeing between the legislature and the governor this year.
Certainly, Casey DeSantis has high approval ratings generally, particularly among Republicans. A recent poll here from the University of North Florida showed that she had, 57% approval rating among the Republican Party members. If she were to run, she would give this governor a succession tool to kind of carry on his legacy, but it also would give Ron DeSantis a greater platform for fundraising and visibility. If he were to mount another presidential campaign, how would you know, forecast whether that is a likely thing or not, whether he would try to return to a presidential run?
Well, I think any elected official who's ever thought of running for president never truly, kind of is able to empty that thought from their head, no matter, what those efforts have entailed. I think it's very possible the governor tries to run for president again. Now, I think there are some challenges to that. You see in some of the, look, President Trump can only serve 4 years by the Constitution, so there will be a new Republican nominee in 2028. The early signs are that there's significant support within the party for his vice president, J.D. Vance, to potentially be that candidate. The president has been careful not to endorse or not endorse anyone for president at this point. He was asked about that in his Super Bowl interview, and he, said he wasn't going to endorse right now Vice President Vance or anyone else. He thought there was a lot of capable people. So whenever there's an open seat, I think that is going to attract interest, particularly from candidates who have run for president. Again, I think one of the challenges, as you point out, is when you stop being in an office like governor, it becomes harder to be relevant day in and day out in terms of your impact on the news, what you're talking about. This not certainly not to take anything away from, because if Casey DeSantis were elected governor, that she would have been elected by the voters, would be governor in her own right. But it certainly keeps one of the benefits of that is it keeps the DeSantis name in the news if he were to announce for president again in 2028.
Sure, and if she's running, I would guess as well, keeps him from appearing quite so much as a lame duck, knowing that he's going to be out of office. But if his wife is going to be his successor, his cachet in Tallahassee and elsewhere would be a lot greater.
Potentially. I think the potential challenge with that theory is that we generally don't do dynasties in this country. That is something that, for the most part, in terms of its political culture, the country has somewhat resisted. And 8 years is a long time to be in office. Again, we'll have to see how this particular Republican primary dynamics play out. If it is just these two candidates, look, we found that when Ron DeSantis was elected governor, that Trump endorsement of him sort of ultimately proved to be decisive and by a large margin in that Republican primary. So I don't think we can underestimate the impact that his endorsement of Byron Donalds will have in that campaign as well. But I think the challenge for Casey DeSantis in running, who's obviously very bright, very articulate, has been obviously very involved in his administration as well. I think the challenge for her is that the 8 years of incumbency, right? People just get to the point where they're ready to move on from an administration that's been there a while. So to some extent, in the same way that I think when Kamala Harris ran for president in 2024, she inherited some of the dissatisfaction with Joe Biden as president because she was running from that standpoint. I think one of the challenges for Casey DeSantis might be that, again, after 8 years in power, that folks may be ready to turn the page to something new from the DeSantis administration. I don't know. She remains popular, and so we'll just have to see how that dynamic plays out. But it's certainly probably an unprecedented situation in Florida politics. There have been other situations in different states around the years where spouses of governors have kind of run for governor and gotten elected, but this is This is very different than some of those in the past, and so that is going to potentially make for an interesting dynamic. She has not declared yet, so we don't know whether she will be a candidate or not at this point. But it seems like that is certainly a possibility.
I want to ask you about that because there was some reporting I think NBC had done saying that she was being encouraged by donors. She was seriously considering the idea of it. And then Ron DeSantis went on Fox News and said she's not going to be seeking that office. And then there was this endorsement of Byron Donald's from the president. And almost immediately, Governor DeSantis started making comments that suggested how great she would be if she were to be governor. And in fact, offering up a kind of posthumous endorsement from Rush Limbaugh saying, he always thought she would be a great governor. Um, what do you make of that series of back and forth? It seems almost like a switch.
I think governors are very, and any executives, elected officials are very interested in their legacies, and they care about who their successor is because they want to try and perpetuate or build that legacy and not see things that they did potentially changed. I think that's a concern of anybody who's leaving elected office, and it's obviously important to Ron DeSantis. And I think there had been, for example, some sense that one of his close allies, Ashley Moody, who was the attorney general, now a U.S. senator that he's appointed from Florida, might be that successor. So since she's in a different role now, I think the governor is trying to sort of position the election with the goal of, again, trying to preserve his legacy and elect the right successor. In his mind, I think obviously the voters have a huge say over this. I think probably also motivating this is that dynamic between Trump and DeSantis. Look, Byron Donalds was a very enthusiastic Ron DeSantis supporter in 2018, very involved in that effort, and had been an ally of that administration. I think he even introduced the DeSantises in 2022 on election night when he was reelected. Shortly after that, he then endorsed Donald Trump for president in 2024. So that's a political alliance that used to exist that doesn't now. That some of those facts may motivate the governor even more, and the fact that Congressman Donalds is running may motivate Governor DeSantis even more to find another candidate in that race.
Some interesting parallels too between Byron Donalds and Ron DeSantis in terms of being, you know, members of Congress, three-term members, and then Trump endorsed. But we have a question from Mark on Instagram. He says DeSantis needs to focus on our homeowners insurance crisis. Um, this is an ongoing issue. It doesn't seem to be resolving itself. Do you think that there is? I mean, there's been a lot of attention by the legislature in previous sessions, a lot of money, billions of dollars spent to try to shore up the insurance industry so it doesn't leave. But in terms of rising prices, where do you see that? Do people have you know, the interest in trying to tackle the price increases?
Well, I think that is going to be an issue that's discussed in the Florida legislature this year because it's a chronic problem. Like I said earlier, even the state's insurer of last resort, Citizens, this year asked for and received a pretty significant premium increase, which, again, I think was probably designed to help encourage people to go back out into the private sector. But look, one of the biggest economic concerns we know is inflation. It almost certainly decided the last presidential election and continues to have impacts. And in Florida, one of the most tangible forms of that inflation is the cost of homeowners insurance. One of the things as we begin to start the legislative session, Ann, and like the question you got on Instagram, I think it's really important. Remember that as citizens, we all have that most important role in American democracy, and it's really important, particularly as session begins. If there are issues that people are concerned about, like the cost of property insurance or housing or whatever the particular issue you care about is, make sure to engage with your elected official. Every one of us has a state representative and a state senator. Make sure you know who those people are. Find ways to engage them, either telephone, email, or if they're having public events, to be able to talk to them there. The surest way to make sure that the legislature is dealing with an issue is to communicate that to your legislator. And look, we know that can be sensitive to public opinion. In what we're seeing with DOGE, frankly, the huge public concerns about the DOGE process is why a bunch of federal legislators have reached out to the Trump administration and said you need to be more transparent about what you're doing. We're getting a lot of negative feedback from our constituents at town halls and other interactions. So it's forcing those legislators into action. I would encourage Florida citizens to do the exact same thing. If there are issues you care about, use that power you have as a citizen to engage with your legislators and try and make sure that issue is on the legislature's agenda. Property insurance is something that affects anyone who owns property here in Florida. It's a chronic challenge. And while the legislature has taken some action in the past, it continues to be a challenge. So, one that citizens should definitely engage on if they have a concern about that.
Sure. And one issue before the legislature this session is something that is very much an outgrowth of citizen dissatisfaction, which is this bill to protect state parks from having golf courses and large hotels and pickleball courts. That bill that is pending is a direct outgrowth of citizen outrage over proposals to do just that.
Well, that's exactly right, Ann. When it came out that there was some consideration to put golf courses and pickleball courts and hotels on state parks, there was really sort of a bipartisan uproar about that potential suggestion. Gail Harrell, the state legislator who's carrying the bill, would ban the state parks department from ever putting those kinds of amenities on state parks. As she put it very well, I think state parks are designed to be natural treasures, and we have to protect those natural treasures. And so that's something I think will pass the legislature probably with a large bipartisan margin. And you're exactly right. Much of that is because citizens express their great concern about those potential impacts on the park system, and the legislature is now responding to that citizen concern.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk somewhat about the pension situation in the city of Jacksonville. Can you give us a brief explainer of why that has become an even bigger problem?
To quote Yogi Berra, this is kind of deja vu all over again. I mean, the city of Jacksonville just can't seem to sort of stop, having to talk about this pension issue. Our colleague Nate Monroe, who is the new executive editor of the Tributary, wrote a piece about this earlier this week. The Jacksonville Police and Fire Pension Fund has just released its most recent actuarial report, a report that kind of chronicles the financial health of the fund. It shows that for the first time, the unfunded liability, in other words, pension debt, the difference between the amount of assets the pension fund has and its obligations to pay has now crossed over into $3 billion for the first time. Means the city will have to make a $200 million contribution in this upcoming year's budget to pay its share of benefits and that unfunded liability. You add this to our general employees pension plan, which has an unfunded liability of about, the new report hasn't come out yet, but somewhere in the ballpark of I think $1.8 billion. That'll be another kind of $120 million or so contribution. So this is a continuing challenge. We also have the challenge that because of some changes that have recently been made, it was agreed that the city is going to allow certain employees to go into the Florida retirement system. The cost of providing pensions is going up substantially. Kind of at the end of the administration I was in, the city kind of reached an agreement where pension payments would be about 10% of pay would be the cost. Those went up in the following administration to about 25% of pay. With the Florida retirement system, could be as much as 40 or even 46% of pay. So a continuing challenge the city will have to pay attention to.
Well, Chris Hand, it is a delight. Thank you so much for being here. I always appreciate it.
It's good to see you, Ann. See you next month.
All right.